Parshas b'chukosai. This week's Parsha begins in b'chukosai telechu with a description of if you walk in my ways and you study the Torah and you perform the mitzvos. This is talking to the nation of Israel as a whole, that things will be good for us, including that the rains will come in the proper time and the economy will be operating well and everyone will benefit and we won't be attacked by the enemies and we'll have a good relationship with the Almighty. And now the Torah talks about, following that, the opening passage, the Torah talks about what happens if we don't follow the Torah. It gets a little bit scary, not quite as scary as in Kisavo, which has a version of the Tochacha, but it's pretty bad. And how do we get to this bad stuff? By abandoning the Torah. But there are two verses that specifically talk about what behavior will bring about the horrible events in as a consequence of that. The Torah says, this is in Pasuk Perek Chavav, Pasuk Psukim Yud Daled and Tesvav. That's chapter 26, verses 14 and 15. They read as follows: V'imlo sishma'u li, and if you will not listen to me, v'lo sa'asu es kol mitzvot ha'ela. And we're going to try to figure out why all this wording here. And you will not perform all of these commandments. Im b'chukosai tim asu. This is in contrast to im b'chukosai telechu. This is if you will reject my chukos, if you consider them to be, as Art Scroll translates, loathsome. Tim asu. Vim es mishpatai tigal nafshechem. And if your very being rejects my statutes, livoti asos is kol mitzvos ha'elav v'chem es brisi, so as not to perform all my commandments and to annul my covenant, then bad stuff happens. Then there's avaniya says oslachem, so I too will reciprocate. We learn from this, or at least deduce, an element of midah connected midah, measure for measure, that the Almighty responds to us in the way that we respond to Him. So if we are tight with Him, He's tight with us. If we reject Him, He rejects us. It's pretty straightforward, at least in concept. So there's a question. Rashi actually asks the question. The verse starts with V'im lo sishmu li, and if you don't listen to me, v'lo sasu es kol mitzvos ha'ela, and you don't do all of these mitzvos. Now, not listen to me in this context sounds like we're not going to do the mitzvos. So if lo sishmu li means you won't do the mitzvos, then what does v'lo sasu es kol mitzvos ha'ela, and you will not do all of these mitzvos? Well, that second one is much more explicit. You won't do the mitzvos means you won't do the mitzvos. So what does lo sishmu li mean? So Rashi, quoting Toras Kohanim, which is the one of the midrashic compilations on Sefer Vayikra. So Rashi says that this means lios amelim batorah. Sishma'u li, listen to me, can mean a bunch of different things. It can mean obey, it can mean physically hear, but it could also mean to listen in a deep way. And the Toras Kohanim says that it means to hear medrash chachamim, lada'as medrash chachamim, to know the derivations, the exegeses, the commentaries, the explanations of the sages. The Meforshim explain that this means not only the written law, but medrash chachamim means that which the sages deduce, and that is an allusion to the oral law. So this means two things. Number one, im lo sishmu li means that you will neglect the study of Torah. And Rabbi Shomshon Hirsch builds on these concepts, which are said very concisely in Rashi and in the Toras Kohanim. Rabbi Hirsch expands on this, and it's worth studying in the, at least for us, for the English translation. He wrote it originally in German. So, number one, lo sishmu li, if you don't study my Torah, Torah shebachsav, Torah shebal peh, the written law, the oral law. So Rav Hirsch explains this will bring a person to neglect the mitzvos. If you neglect the Torah, you neglect the mitzvos. And perhaps stop observing the mitzvos, or observe only those mitzvos that you like, that you're comfortable with. And that's implicit in lasos es kol ha-mitzvos. If you don't do all of the mitzvos, in other words, you're selective about it, that starts your decline. Or it can lead to this. It would not be surprising to lead to this. And then the next verse, V'im b'chukosai tim asu. And if you reject my laws, and Rav Hirsch says that if a person, number one, stops learning God's word, number two, stops performing all the mitzvos, then the next thing he does, or is likely to do, or is at risk of doing, is to rationalize his disobedience by dismissing the Torah as perhaps as being antiquated, as being irrelevant, as having been written for a different time. There are countless rationales for being dismissive of the Torah. In other words, you could say, I'd like to observe, but my Yetzer Hara, my evil inclination, has taken the best of me, or I wasn't raised this way, it's very difficult, etc. But inevitably, for some, the slide leads lower and lower. And the slide from not observing the mitzvos is to rationalize that they're really not worth observing, and a person then will look with contempt on the Torah as well as those who obey it. And that leads to the im es mishpatai tigal nafshechem. You begin to have not only a contempt for people who observe the Torah, but one is at risk for developing a contempt for people who teach Torah, for the scholars of Torah, for the bearers of tradition. After all, if a person rejects the tradition, then he can't maintain a high regard for the scholars and for their observance without having a serious amount of cognitive dissonance. It must be painful. If you recognize the legitimacy of a certain system, but you can't comply with the system, it creates a dissonance. So one of the ways to overcome that dissonance, of course, would be to observe. Another way is to dismiss the whole thing and to hold it and its teachers in contempt. The next phrase, Levilti asos es kol mitzvosai, to desist from doing all of my mitzvos. Now, we already said, Velos asos kol mitzvosela. So what does this mean? This means that not only does the individual not observe the Torah, not only does he hold the mitzvos in contempt and those who teach it in contempt, but he becomes intolerant of people who observe. We see this a lot in the news. We have seen it a lot in the news over this past couple of years. Again, driven, says Rav Hirsch, by a person's need to protect himself and to avoid the pain of the inconsistency of his belief and his actions. So instead of resolving his actions to be consistent with his belief, he resolves his belief to be inconsistent with his actions, and therefore he demeans and dismisses and becomes intolerant. It becomes, in Rav Hirsch's words, fanatically intolerant. Just anybody who observes is automatically an enemy. Mitzvos can't be performed. So then a person becomes a kofer ba mitzvos. He denies not only holds in contempt, he says mitzvos are worthless. As a matter of fact, he might even say that they're harmful. What's the ultimate conclusion of this? It's the final phrase, lahafrechem esprisi. The ultimate rejection is to reject God's covenant. And what this really means is the last, as Rav Hirsch says, the last thread that binds him to God's covenant. And then in the words of the Toras Kohanim, he's kofer be'ikr. That is a rabbinic phrase for rejecting the notion of a God, a creator, a God, an all-knowing God, an all-present God. Kofer be'ikr. Ikr means the essential thing. For somebody who is theocentric, for somebody who views the center of the universe, the most important element of the universe, as being God, so that's the ikr. And to be kofer ba'ikr, to deny that which lies at the core of our belief system, puts a person all the way out, as the Baal Haggadah says about the ben drasha, the evil child, who says, "Ma avodah zos lachem," what is this work for you? And the Haggadah says, "Lefi shehotzias hatzmo min haklal," since he removed himself from the group, kafar be'ikr. So what Rav Hirsch, Toras Kohanim, Rashi, other Meforshim, what they're saying is, many things in life lead to a slippery slope. Not everything, but it can lead. And a person's lack of diligence or lack of responsibility at one end can have devastating and destructive consequences at the other end. A person can lead a life where he's disconnected from Torah. He's at risk from leading a life that's disconnected from that which is most important in this world, which is a relationship with the Almighty. The converse is also true. That if a person learns Torah, then that person can repair all the other issues and can be motivated to observe, and will have kavod for those who observe, will respect those who observe, and will respect the rabbis and the teachers and the role models, and ultimately will understand that he has a deep connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that all devolves from a dedication, a commitment to the study of Torah. Have a good chance.